So, yes, hello, welcome, happy Monday. My name's Carol White Evans, and I'm the Chemicals and the Environment Agent here at the Extension Office in Sarasota County. I'm joined by my co-worker today, Sarah Bostic, our Sustainable Ag Agent, as well as our colleague Mindy, who does the amazing job at the chat box and is so important to this whole thing running smoothly. We also have Wilma on our call today. She is our Florida-friendly specialist, and so we can tap into her today as well. So I wanted to say, to also mention that our communications guru, Kevin, who does an amazing job of getting these videos loaded and into our website. We also have a weekly blog. We've been pretty good about doing it weekly associated with this series. So please go to the website and check it out. Today we have one request to see if this works. If you wouldn't mind trying to renaming yourself, if you have your name is iPad on that shows up, it's really difficult for us to follow that and figure out who you are. And so if you could just rename it to either your first name or your first name and last name, or your first name and your last initial, we'd be very, that'd be very beneficial for us. If not, you can also just put it in the chat box to us. So today, thank you for joining our Edible Garden series. This is offered every Monday from noon to about 12:30ish. This week's topic is lanai gardening, insects, pollinators, and other challenges. I'll spend a little over 10 minutes discussing the topic, and then we'll open it up for question. We will also be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation. So if you can type your question into the chat box at any time during the presentation. Your questions do not have to be specific to the presentation. You can ask anything about gardening. So any questions that we don't get to today or need further discussion on, like always, we will provide in a follow-up email. So let's get going. So this webinar series came out of hearing over and over again from our county residents. They're really frustrated over trying to garden in Florida. These are customers that are either new to gardening, have been trying to garden, or actually have moved from another state. Gardening in Florida, as well as we found out, many other locations can be quite difficult, but the rewards are amazing. So this series grew out of that need for more information about gardening. And being Extension, we're very excited to be able to offer that support to our community. Also, we wanted to give a shout out to our gardeners outside of Florida. So happy to see the people from all over the country, as well as some of our international gardeners join our weekly webinar. So it's really rewarding for us to see that response. So nextly, so poll. So Sarah, by any chance, did you get that in there? Sarah? I think she's still trying. This was tough. So we'll try this at the end. We just want to try to get some demographic data. So on to our presentation. So gardening on the lanai or any other type of screened enclosure comes with some challenges that we don't always anticipate. Due to our here in Florida, due to our fairly mild temperatures, it's a convenient and easy way to bring our garden inside onto the lanai to continue our gardening efforts, whether it's during the winter or early spring. Also during the summer when things get really, really intensely hot here. However, there are challenges that we may not realize that that are things we need to factor into. Those are things like light, container choices, our watering, pest insects, and beneficial insects. So we're going to address each of those in the next 10 minutes. So the first challenge is light. Light is one of the driving factors behind plant success, right? The plant feeds itself through photosynthesis, and this requires light. So lanai screens can filter out anywhere between 30 to 80% of the UV light, depending on which type of screen is on that structure, which in Florida, well, and it can be up to 15% cooler, in 15 degrees cooler in Florida, which is great in the summer, but that can be extremely beneficial. And although it may have some advantages, during the winter may not be as advantageous. So do plants need UV light? So the answer is yes. UV light has been shown to help speed up the process of photosynthesis and lead to increased plant growth. UVA can increase plant yields. So according to a recent study, plants will grow bigger and faster because of the impact that UV light has on them. UVA can increase the level of nutrients from plants, and therefore plants can be tastier. And it also has been shown that UVA will make plants more resistant to fungal infections, right? Because it heats them up, so it's harder for funguses to set in. Deciding which plants will work on your screen enclosure is the key, right, with that light requirement. So any plant that produces flowers or fruits depends on intense light. So they're going to require at least 8 hours of direct sunlight to produce their flowers or their fruit. So the plants that do really well in lower condition lights are more of our leafy type plants. So most herbs grow really well in limited light, but those that are especially beneficial or successful are things like basil and rosemary, parsley, mint, chives, thyme, oregano, and cilantro. Also like lemongrass and sage does really well. So basically, most of your basic herbs do really well. And the vegetables that grow well in low light condition are the greens, right? So chards, spinach, kale, salad greens, and microgreens. There are a few limited root vegetables that do well in limited lights, and that's things like beets, carrots, and potatoes. Now, one thing people ask, and you see this a lot, are the strawberry pots, right? So strawberries are one of the fruits that are kind of a hit and miss. So although they do okay in partial shade, they really do need full direct sun in order to produce those strawberries. But just remember that all plants need some amount of light to grow, right? So you can't completely cut off all your light to your plants. So I just really like these pictures, so I wanted to put up there just to reinforce that it's really the herbs and the leafy vegetables that grow best in screened enclosures. Now for your containers. So I'm only going to talk quickly about this since it's the subject of one of our upcoming presentations. So which container you decide to use is mainly determined by really the area that you have available to grow. So how much room do you have? Do you have space for traditional containers or pots, or do you have a really small area to work with? So if you have limited area, then you can garden up, right? You can go vertical. You can make some fabulous garden shelves out of old pallets. Just make sure those pallets are not treated wood. Shoe racks that you hang on the wall work really well in a limited space. So, you know, those things you can do, especially with herbs, as do things like office carts that have shelves on them. And you can drill holes in the shelf, or you can have the wire shelving. So how fancy or basic you want your garden to be is completely up to you. Also, you have to consider your access to water. Do you have a hose bib where you can use a hose with a spray nozzle to do your watering, or will you be using a watering can? Or maybe you set up a micro irrigation system. So these are all things that you need to consider before you really even start your garden. So the one thing you have to think about when you're watering and the type of container or pot that you have is what's going to happen to the water and that soil and that debris that actually ends up then seeping out onto the floor. A pot without a catchment container underneath, or a vertical garden that drips down onto the floor, can cause, you know, pretty intense algae buildup, which makes that floor really slippery and dangerous for you. So this can be difficult to clean up, especially once that mold starts to set in and it grows into your flooring, and it's hard to get up. So just beware of that. One way to solve this challenge of water and soil getting onto the floor is to use wicking bed containers. So these are self-contained planting beds that can be homemade or purchased as a kit. Since they're plastic bins, it eliminates that spillage onto the floor. So you can set it up to be basically semi-permanent system that you can move, you know, as you need to, or move around your lanai or even back outside. So Another big challenge we have of gardening on a screen lanai is the problem with insects. So we tend to think that since we're in an enclosed area that no insects can get in. Well, that's true to a point, right? But it's usually the pest insects that manage to find their way inside and not the beneficials. So since there's very little air movement in an enclosed lanai, and that area tends to stay fairly damp, especially where you have all your plants, the plants are prone to infestation by a few of the common pest insects. So things like fungus gnats, whitefly, aphids, and spider mites. Snails also can be an issue at times, but they're pretty easy to find, and they have limited places to hide, and they're fairly large, so you can find snails pretty easily and dispose of them. So these infestations can get out of control pretty quickly because although the pest insect finds its way inside the lanai, it's much more difficult for the beneficial insects to get into the screen lanai. And this goes for both pollinators as well as the natural enemies of these pest insects. So fungus gnat, this is kind of going to be one of the main ones. So fungus gnats are mainly a nuisance, but the larval stage actually can do damage to the plant roots. Fungus gnats are attracted to and they live in moist soil. The adult is this really tiny mosquito-like insect that does not feed. So the adult does not feed. However, it lays its eggs in the soil, basically on the top of the soil, and that immature larvae feeds on the organic matter and the algae that's in that soil. So if there's a big enough infestation and you kind of let it get out of control, the larvae actually will move to the root system and feed on the roots. So this potentially can alter the plant and end up killing the plant. So the good news is that they're really easy to control. So the first thing to do is to not overwater. That's like the primary reason why you get fungus gnats. So the eggs and the larvae are found in that top 2 inches of soil. So letting that top 2 inches dry out, we talked about this last week too, but letting that top 2 inches dry out before watering is really important to breaking that life cycle, right? Because that larvae needs that water to survive. So also for the larvae, you can also place pieces of cut potato on the soil surface. They cannot resist a piece of cut potato. So that the larvae will go to that piece of cut potato, then you just dispose of that, and then you put in a new slice when it's, you need to replace it. So you can also sprinkle the thing called mosquito bits on top of the soil. So every time you water, the bacteria that's impregnated on the corncob bits will then enter the soil. The larvae, as they're feeding then, will feed on the bacteria, inadvertently they feed on the bacteria, and then they die within days. So for the adults, you can just place yellow sticky cards around. So you can put them on sticks and put them inside the plants, or you can hang them just above the plants. But really, fungus gnats are going to stay fairly localized to that plant. So for two-spotted spider mite, they're another common invader of plants on screen lanais. They love that still air, and they will quickly infest a plant, and they're really hard to get to remove once that infestation starts to get out of control. Monitoring is the key to keeping your garden plant spider mite free. So investing in a hand lens or some type of a magnifying glass will be extremely helpful in monitoring your plant. If you do get spider mites, there are a few controls that you can apply. First thing, if it's pretty infested and you're seeing webbing, the best thing to do is really just to trim off that piece, put it in a plastic bag, and throw it in the trash. So trimming off that, because it's hard for any spray application to penetrate webbing. So you need to get rid of that webbing first. But you can use biorational products such as neem or horticultural oils, but you can also try azadirachtin, which is a component of neem oil, and it works really well on quite a few insects. But spider mites are one. Spider mites are not an insect, right? They're an arachnid, but azadirachtin does work against spider mites. Yellow sticky cards are not as effective against spider mites since they really stay fairly close to the plant, but yellow sticky cards are pretty good for most other insects. So silverleaf whitefly. So like the spider mite, whitefly can get out of control fairly quickly and they can devastate your garden, both inside and outside the screen lanai. So the whitefly, they love, especially the silverleaf whitefly, love garden plants, especially things like tomatoes, peppers, and lettuce. So the thing is, it will also infest most of your landscape ornamentals. So keeping whitefly under control is really important. So whitefly mainly infests the underside of leaves. So it's really important when you're monitoring to monitor closely, but to physically turn that leaf over to check for the bottom side to see if you have any infestation. The adults feed, and then the females will lay their eggs while they're feeding. So they're kind of multitaskers, right? So all stages of whitefly are harmful to your plants. Whitefly also vector a bunch of plant viruses. So early intervention is important when you see whitefly in your lanai or your screened enclosure. Controls for whitefly are very similar to spider mites. So neem oil, horticultural oils, and azadirachtin work. But insecticidal soap also is an additional biorational that will work against whiteflies at the early stages of infestation. So let's transition a bit from pest insects to beneficial insects. Beneficials include our pollinators and the natural enemies, which are our predators and our parasitoids. We'll cover the pollinators first. So many plants require pollinators in order to produce. Since an enclosure does not allow pollinators such as bees, butterflies, flies, and beetles to have access to your garden plants in that enclosed area, you're going to need to make sure you grow plants that are self-pollinating. So many of the root vegetables, leafy green vegetables, and herbs do not rely on pollinators or other methods in order to produce. Some of these are like radishes, beets, carrots, onions, lettuces, and then members of the cabbage family and most of your herbs. So as you can see, there's a lot of crossover between plants that can grow in low or reduced light and plants that do not require pollinators in order to produce. So now for the biological controls. So these are your natural enemies. So when you garden in the yard, there are many natural enemies that are outside to help you control your pest insects. Of the predators, the most abundant being ladybugs and green lacewing, feed on most of the insect pests found in the garden. Normally, both the adult and the immature stages feed on pest insects, but it's usually the immature that is the most active feeder. The problem is the predators are usually quite a bit bigger than the pest insects, so getting access into your enclosed area, such as your screen lanai, is very difficult. So when the natural enemies are excluded, your pest insects are going to be able to reproduce and cause a lot more damage in an environment that's free of those natural controls. So it's really difficult with for those biological agents to get into your screen lanai because of their size. However, the next one, so those are your natural enemies. These are your parasitoids. So parasitoids are usually wasps or flies, and they're really small. They're host specific, meaning they will only feed and lay eggs on one species of insect or maybe two. Although they may be able to get into the screened enclosure because of their size, the challenge is having enough of an infestation for that parasitoid to be able to complete their life cycle. Also, the other challenge to parasitoids are those yellow sticky cards, right? They're great passive traps to collect our pest insects, but unfortunately, because they're passive, whatever runs into them is going to stick to them and die. And so yellow sticky cards are quite detrimental to any parasitoids that are flying around. So really, ultimately, natural enemies are going to have a difficult time helping you with your insect control. So your option is to be very vigilant about monitoring for pest insects. Monitoring will let you know what insects are present and at what levels you have them, so you can then plan for your, how you're going to control those insects. Invest in a hand lens or a magnifying glass. Be sure to look on the underside of the leaves Make sure to check the soil and be very vigilant in your monitoring so that you can enjoy the products of your labor and not let the insects enjoy those products. So with that, I think I stuck to around 10 minutes. It's so good seeing you every week. And I think we even had some new people this week, which is even better.